I wish I had said something earlier, but I'd spent most of my life being the woman who doesn't make a fuss, and old habits don't break easy, especially not at 63. My name is Frances Holbrook. I live in a semi-detached, on a quiet street in Oakville, Ontario, the same house where I raised my son and tended a garden that now blooms mostly for the squirrels. My husband passed 4 years ago, a stroke, quick, no warning, and since then I've been learning the strange art of taking up less space, not on purpose, not at first. But grief has a way of making you smaller, and I got so good at being small that eventually people stopped noticing I was there. My son is 36 now, tall like his father, same stubborn jaw. He works in corporate finance downtown Toronto, does well for himself, travels constantly. When he married his wife 2 years ago, I stood at the back of the church in a green dress and cried the good kind of tears. She's a sharp woman, warm when she wants to be, comes from a tight-knit Korean-Canadian family in North York. Her parents had immigrated from Busan in the early 90s, built a small empire of dry cleaning shops and then a commercial laundry business that now contracts with hotels across the GTA. They were the kind of people who worked without complaint and expected the same from everyone around them. I liked them from the start. I just wasn't sure they liked me. I told myself it didn't matter. My son was happy. That was enough. The invitation came on a Wednesday in late October, one of those grey Toronto days where the sky can't decide whether to rain or just threaten. My son called, which he rarely does. He's more of a text person, and I almost knocked over my coffee answering in a hurry. He asked how I was. I said fine. There was a pause that I knew meant he needed something. He explained that his in-laws were hosting a dinner that Saturday. Important guests. A developer from Seoul and his business partner, both interested in expanding a commercial real estate venture into the Canadian market. The family had been courting this partnership for over a year. His father-in-law wanted the table to feel like family, not a boardroom. My son's wife had suggested I come. Showing up with his wife's family and his own mother together would look good, he said, warm, grounded. You want me there to make the table look fuller, I said. Mum, no, it's not like that. But it was a little like that, and we both knew it. Still, I said yes, because the alternative was another Saturday with the news on too loud and dinner for one. I spent longer than I should have choosing what to wear. I settled on a burgundy blouse and dark slacks. Nothing navy. I'd worn navy to the last 2 family events, and I was tired of disappearing into the furniture. Here is the thing nobody knew. The thing I hadn't told my son, hadn't told anyone outside of my late husband, and a handful of people who'd long since drifted out of my life. I speak Korean, not textbook Korean, real Korean, the kind we learn from living inside a place, from buying vegetables in a market where no one speaks your language, from neighbours who teach you things you can't find in any phrase book. I was 25 when I went. It was 1986, and I had a degree in cultural studies from McMaster that felt approximately as useful as a decorative plate. A girlfriend of mine from university had taken a contract teaching English in Seoul and wrote me long letters about how alive everything felt. I saved money for 8 months, bought a one-way ticket, and told my parents I'd be back by Christmas. I was back in Canada 7 years later. I lived in Itaewon first, then moved to a quieter neighbourhood in Mapo. I taught English, did some translation work, made friends with the ajumas at the market on my corner who thought it was hilarious that a freckled Canadian woman was trying to barter in their language. I wasn't perfect, but I was persistent. And language, I've always believed, rewards persistence more than talent. I came home for my father's health. Met my husband at a cousin's New Year's party, 3 months after I landed back in Oakville. He was a civil engineer with no interest in Korea or Korean, and enough charm to make me not care. We built a life. We had our son. My years in Seoul became something I carried quietly, the way you carry old photographs. They're there, they're real, but they stop being part of the daily conversation. My son never knew. It felt irrelevant by the time he was old enough to ask. And then it felt like too much to explain. And then it just became one of those things you mean to bring up and never do. The drive to his in-laws' house in North York took 40 minutes on a Saturday. The house was a large detached with a circular driveway, well kept in the particular way of people who take pride seriously. There were already 3 cars when I arrived. Through the front window I could see the warm glow of the kitchen and hear what sounded like multiple conversations happening at once. My daughter-in-law answered the door. She looked beautiful, genuinely happy to see me, which always caught me off guard. She took my coat, asked if I'd eaten, and guided me through the entryway toward the living room. Her mother greeted me with both hands. She was a small, composed woman who smiled with her whole face. Her father came in behind her, shaking my hand with the firm grip of someone who had spent decades in physical work. They were warm. I felt it, and I appreciated it. The guests had already arrived, 2 men in their late 50s, one in a well-cut grey suit, the other slightly younger in navy. I noticed the navy, I always notice it, both standing near the fireplace. They were introduced as business associates visiting from Seoul, looking at investment properties across the Greater Toronto area. My son was there, looking polished and a little tense in the way he gets before things he considers high stakes. He kissed my cheek and whispered that he was glad I came. I was seated in the living room in a high-backed chair slightly outside the main conversation circle. Not excluded, but not quite included either. There's a particular geometry to these situations, a way bodies arrange themselves around the important people, and I had been placed in the decorative perimeter, the woman who makes the table look full. I nursed a glass of barley tea and observed. The guests spoke primarily in Korean to their hosts, switching to careful English when my son joined the conversation. My daughter-in-law translated occasionally, smoothly, her Korean polished from a childhood spent between 2 languages. The discussion was about the development project, commercial mixed use, somewhere in Mississauga. Numbers that sounded large even to someone who doesn't follow real estate. The visiting investor, the one in grey, was asking questions about the family's business history, their community ties, the kind of soft questions that are really hard questions in disguise. He wasn't just evaluating the deal, he was evaluating the people. My daughter-in-law's mother refilled everyone's tea. She was attentive in that particular way, making sure no glass was empty, no plate unattended, and I could see how much of herself she had put into this evening. Then the conversation shifted, the way it does when people feel comfortable. My daughter-in-law's mother said something to the investor in Korean. She said it with a smile, the kind of smile that softens the edges of what you're actually saying. She said that her daughter had married a good man, hard-working, ambitious, but she worried sometimes. She said that in their family, children stayed close. They called, they visited, they made time. Her daughter called every day. Her daughter came for Sunday dinner, but her son-in-law, she tilted her head in my son's direction. He was the Canadian way, busy, always the next thing. The investor nodded and said something I caught clearly, that in his experience the way a man treated his family told you everything about how he'd treat a business relationship. My daughter-in-law's mother glanced briefly in my direction. I held my expression still, politely blank, the face of someone who understands nothing, and then she continued. She said that the mother, gesturing loosely toward me, seemed like a nice woman but distant, that she sat apart, that she and her son didn't seem close in the way families should be close. She wasn't being cruel. Her tone was almost sympathetic, the way people sound when they're explaining a disappointment rather than attacking someone. She said something like, "Some families are just like that here. It is cultural. You learn to accept it." Her husband added quietly that the older woman looked lonely. He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone notes the weather. The investor said again in Korean that this was his concern about moving operations to Canada. The family values were different. He needed partners whose priorities were right. His business partner, the younger one, leaned close and said he wasn't sure, that the son seemed capable, but that the family picture didn't sit right with him. My hands were in my lap. I felt my pulse in my fingertips. My son was 3 feet away, smiling at something my daughter-in-law had just said in English, completely unaware that the conversation at the other end of the room was deciding his future. Everything I'd told myself about not making a fuss, about staying small, about being grateful just to be included, all of it sat right there in that moment, pressing down. Then my daughter-in-law's mother said, still in Korean, that she didn't mean to speak poorly of anyone. She just wanted to be honest with their guests. She hoped they would understand that her daughter had made a good choice, even if the other family was, she chose her words carefully, different in their ways. Different, I set down my tea. I looked at my daughter-in-law's mother and I said, in Korean, not the careful, textbook Korean of a language class, but the lived Korean, the cadence of mapo markets and late-night pojangmacha conversations, I said, please forgive me for not speaking sooner. I have been understanding everything said this evening, and I think there are a few things worth clarifying. The room stopped. Not figuratively, actually stopped. The investor's cup was halfway to his mouth and it stayed there. My daughter-in-law's father turned his head slowly. My son looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between shock and wonder. My daughter-in-law's mother went very still. The investor recovered first. He set down his cup and looked at me with genuine interest, not embarrassment, which I respected. He asked in Korean, where I had learned. I told him. Seoul, 1986, 7 years. Mapo neighborhood. Teaching English, doing translation, living an entire life before the one that came after. He smiled, a real one, the kind that takes over the whole face. He said my accent was old-fashioned, 80s, Seoul, and he meant it as a compliment. I turned to my daughter-in-law's mother then. I switched back to English so that my son could follow, because what I needed to say was for him as much as anyone. I told her she wasn't wrong about the distance between my son and me, but she had the cause backwards. My son didn't pull away from me. I pushed him away, gradually, with the best intentions. After his father died, I decided the most loving thing I could do was not become a burden. So I said I was fine when I wasn't. I stopped calling as much. I turned down invitations because I didn't want to intrude on a young couple's life. I made myself easy to forget about, and then I was quietly devastated when they forgot. I said it plainly, not to make anyone feel guilty, but because it was true, and I had not said it out loud before, not even to myself in those honest 3 a.m. moments. I looked at my son. His jaw was tight in the way that means he's trying not to cry, exactly like his father used to do. I told the investor I addressed him directly in Korean, then repeated it in English, that my son was not a man without values. He was a man whose mother spent 4 years telling him she was fine. He believed her because she was convincing. That is not a character flaw. That is a son who trusted his mother. The investor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in English, that he appreciated honesty, that in 30 years of business he had learned to distrust situations that looked too smooth. This, he said, gesturing at the room, felt real. My daughter-in-law's mother stood up. She came across the room and sat on the ottoman near my chair. She said she was sorry, that she had made assumptions, that she had seen her daughter's marriage from one side only, and had filled in what she didn't know with guesses. I told her I understood. I told her I had been giving people good reason to make those guesses, and I needed to stop. My daughter-in-law had tears on her face and was pretending she didn't. She said she should have tried harder to include me, that she had assumed I preferred my space. I told her that was fair. I had worked very hard to seem like I preferred my space, but that I would appreciate being asked, going forward, rather than assumed about. My son had moved to the arm of my chair at some point during this. I'm not sure when. He put his hand over mine, the way he used to when he was small and had a nightmare and needed to know I was real. "Why didn't you tell me about Korea?" he said quietly. "Because it felt like bragging about someone I no longer was. That's the most ridiculous thing you've ever said to me." That made me laugh. And once I started laughing, it was hard to stop. And then my daughter-in-law was laughing too, and the tension in the room dissolved into something warmer and stranger than any of us had planned for. Dinner was served. We moved to the table. I was placed near the investor, who it turned out had spent 3 years living in Vancouver in the 90s and had thoughts about the differences between Canadian coasts that kept us occupied through most of the main course. His business partner, it emerged, had a mother who had done something similar, left home young, built a quiet life elsewhere, kept a whole private history folded up inside herself. "It's a certain kind of woman," he said, "strong enough not to need anything, too strong sometimes." I thought about that. My daughter-in-law's mother made galbi and japchae and a seafood pancake that was better than anything I'd eaten since the last time I was in a Korean home in the 90s. I told her so, in Korean, and she beamed in a way that felt like the beginning of something. Near the end of the evening, while people were moving back to the living room and my son was helping carry dishes, the investor came to stand beside me near the window. He said his company was going to proceed with looking seriously at the partnership. He said he hoped I didn't mind, but he had a proposal. His company worked regularly with a consulting firm that advised on cultural positioning for Korean businesses entering the Canadian market. The work involved meetings in Toronto and occasional trips back to Seoul for context sessions. He had been struggling to find consultants who understood both sides without performing one of them. People who had actually lived the experience, not just studied it. He asked if I would be interested in speaking with the firm. I looked at him. I thought about my house in Oakville, the garden the squirrels had claimed, the evenings that lasted too long. I said I would be very interested. He gave me a card. Old-fashioned, I liked him for that. When the evening ended and I was putting on my coat in the entryway, my son came and stood beside me. He said he was sorry, not in the loose, reflexive way people apologize, but in the specific way, itemizing things, for the 3-week silences, for the missed calls, for the Sunday dinners he'd meant to organize and hadn't, for letting himself believe I was fine because it was easier than asking harder questions. I told him I had made it very easy for him to believe I was fine. He said that wasn't an excuse. I said it wasn't an accusation. We stood there for a moment in the entryway of his in-laws' house, and it felt like something that had been slightly out of alignment for 4 years, quietly clicked back into place. He asked if I wanted to come to their place the following Sunday. I said yes before he finished the sentence. He hugged me, the kind that lasts a few seconds longer than the polite version, and then his wife appeared and hugged me too. And then, I hadn't expected this, her mother came and took both my hands and said something in Korean that roughly translates to, "I think we started badly, but we can start again." I agreed that we could. The drive home was 40 minutes, same as the drive there, but it felt different. I had the radio on low, the highway lights doing that orange smear across the windshield, and I was thinking about Seoul, about the woman I had been at 25 with a one-way ticket and no particular plan, about how I had spent the last 4 years shrinking myself down to fit inside a grief I thought I had no right to impose on anyone else. I had told myself I was being considerate, low maintenance, easy. What I had actually been doing was disappearing, one careful step at a time, and waiting, without admitting I was waiting, for someone to notice and ask me to come back. No one had asked, because I had told everyone I was fine. I pulled into my driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The house was dark, as it always was when I came home alone, but the darkness felt different that night, less like an ending, more like a pause. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text from my son. Had no idea about Korea. Need to hear everything. Sunday can't come fast enough. Then one from my daughter-in-law. Thank you for tonight. Please teach me how to say something kind in Korean. I want to say it to my mother next time, and I think she would love hearing it from me. Then, about 10 minutes later, an email. The investor's name in the subject line. He had already forwarded my name to the consulting firm. He said he hoped I wouldn't consider it presumptuous. He said, and this part I read twice, that in his experience the people who understood the most were always the ones who looked, from the outside, like they had nothing remarkable about them. I sat in my car reading that line in the dark. I had spent 4 years being unremarkable on purpose, trying to be easy, trying to be no trouble, making myself small enough that losing me wouldn't inconvenience anyone. It had never occurred to me that the things I had buried were actually worth something, that the life I'd lived before I became a wife and mother and then a widow wasn't an embarrassing detour from my real story. It was part of it. Maybe the most interesting part. I went inside, made tea, stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard, at the garden that needed cutting back, and the old cedar fence that my husband had built with his own hands. The summer our son turned 7. I thought, I'm still here. I still have things to say. It had taken a dinner table in North York and a conversation in a language no one expected me to know to remind me of that. But sometimes the reminder comes late and you take it anyway. I pulled up the consulting firm's website, read for a while, found a contact form, started typing. Outside, somewhere in the maple on the back fence, a bird sang once and then went quiet. The kind of small, ordinary thing you only notice when you finally stopped bracing for silence. I hit send. I keep thinking about the moment I set down that cup of barley tea. Such a small thing. A ceramic cup on a wooden side table in a house in North York. But that was the moment everything changed. Not because of what I said next, but because of what I finally stopped pretending. For 4 years I had been making a choice and calling it consideration. I told myself I was being respectful of my son's time, his marriage, his busy life. But if I'm honest, and I'm trying very hard now to be honest, I was also protecting myself. If you never ask to be included, you can't be told no. If you make yourself easy to leave behind, you don't have to sit with the fear that someone chose to leave you. I had dressed my loneliness up as selflessness and convinced myself it was a virtue. What happened that evening showed me the cost of that kind of thinking. My silence, my careful, well-intentioned silence, had built a picture of my son that wasn't true. His in-laws saw a man who didn't call his mother, who didn't keep her close, who had perhaps absorbed the Canadian habit of putting work before people. And a man walking into a partnership built on family trust was about to lose it. Not because of anything he had done, but because I had spent 4 years performing a version of myself that didn't need anything from anyone. That is the quiet damage of dishonesty that comes dressed as strength. We think we are being brave when we say we're fine. Sometimes we are just being afraid, and the people who love us pay for it. Frances from 7 years in Seoul, the woman who learned a language by stubbornness alone, because she refused to be a tourist in her own life. She knew something the Frances in Oakville had forgotten. That you don't get to matter to people you keep at arm's length. That real connection requires the willingness to be known, including the inconvenient parts, the lonely parts, the parts that might burden someone. The intelligence to understand that being seen is not the same as being a burden. That took me longer than it should have. And then there is the matter of simply not giving up. Not on your son, not on the possibility of a new chapter, not on yourself when the house is dark and the garden has gone to the squirrels and the silence has become your default companion. I hit send on that contact form and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, but readiness. The sense that there was still somewhere to go. I think about Mr. Jeon saying that the people who understood the most were always the ones who looked from the outside like they had nothing remarkable about them. I sat with that for a long time, because I had made myself unremarkable on purpose. and I had called it being low maintenance, and I had believed it right up until the moment a room full of people heard me speak in a language they didn't expect, and everything shifted. Not because of the Korean. Because I finally told the truth. That is the thing I want to remember. The truth cost me nothing and gave me everything back.